Great. So welcome everybody. I hope you can hear back there. My name's Chino. I'm with Unity and Struggle. I have to start out. Ren, who is another member of Unity and Struggle, who is going to moderate tonight, is sick. She caught the flu coming back from Hong Kong. So we figured there's already one health emergency in New York City, so we should just swap out with somebody else. There's a measles outbreak in Brooklyn.
Oh, is that
Okay, just letting everyone know. I'll say a little bit, introduce the event tonight, and we're really pleased to have Ralf here visiting from Europe, and then our other speakers tonight as well. Just a little bit about ourselves. Unity and Struggle is a nationwide anti-state communist collective. We have some people here in New York and several other cities working on a variety of projects. A few other ones that are coming up fairly soon. We're right now, you may have seen on Facebook, we're sponsoring a series of study groups on the new book, Capital City, Gentrification in the Real Estate State by Sam Stein. After the recent victory against Amazon, there's a lot of activity in the anti-gentrification movement. There will be a citywide event, organizers roundtable, about that on the 18th at First Unitarian Church in Brooklyn. And we're also collaborating with other groups on a film series, Cine Respaldo, Women in Revolution film series in Sunset Park. Yep. And the first one will be on the 25th. I think there's flyers for this over here. There are? Great. And the first film in that series will be After the Revolution, Después del Zapatismo, about the experience of the Zapatista revolution on women in Chiapas. So both of those should be pretty good. I'll introduce our speakers tonight, and then maybe give Ralf a little time to speak, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion. Ralf Ruckus, who's visiting from Europe, supports and analyzes social struggles in China and elsewhere. He works on the website Gongqiao, which we linked to in the Facebook event, and hopefully people got to peek at. And the talk you'll be giving tonight, you'll say a little bit about it, but it's part of a two-book project. We'll let Ralf lay out some of his understanding of the history of class struggle in China, and the stakes of our different readings of that history for what's going on today. And then we'll invite up Loren Goldner and Kevin Lin to have a discussion about that interpretation of history. Loren Goldner is an editor of Insurgent Notes. He's also a writer and activist who's based in Brooklyn. And many of his individual writings are on the website Break Their Haughty Power, breaktheirhaughtypower.org. Kevin Lin's an activist and researcher of the Chinese labor movement. He's an editor of Made in China, which is a quarterly journal you may have seen online, on Chinese labor, civil society, and rights. That's madeinchinajournal.com. So that's great. Thanks everyone for coming out. We'll just get started. And Ralf, I'll hand it to you.
Okay, I take this microphone. You hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here again, like after a few years not being here. This is a talk in a bookstore about a book that has not come out, which is kind of unusual. I still decided to do this because it's quite a ambitious project also for me to do this, and I want to try out some of the ideas that I'm developing in the book in public talks to get critique and comments. So feel free to throw anything that you have in mind after the talk at me, because I will use that. I need that for finishing the book. The book will come out at PM Press next year, and I spend some time this year to finish it. My background is actually I'm also kind of more like an activist, but I've been involved in like China discussions for about 15 years now. Being like spending some time in China, obviously every year, and trying to get involved in debates in the Chinese left on labor struggles, gender relations, and of course all political aspects in China. I have focused mostly on like exploitation and world market factories, and like migrant worker stories and stuff like this over the years, and published some books or translated books mostly and published some text, and of course also on forms of unrest, strikes, organization, resistance. And in these discussions, I often came across, obviously like sort of discussions about definition of what do we call like the current system in China? Is that still socialism? The Communist Party says it's still socialism, or it's like some kind of like market socialism with Chinese characteristics. And some, people take that serious. Like in Europe and a part of the kind of like socialist scene thinks China is still socialist, right? So while among, let's say, more the grassroots activists in China, it's clear that China is capitalist. So there's some kind of confusion. Of course, you have also like sort of certain Maoist positions that criticize China, today's China, as being capitalist, but have a very positive attitude towards the Chinese history. And this is another, like I said, there's a second confusion about what actually Maoism was as a system, what happened during that time. And one thing I realized, talking both to like activists in China and workers, but also talking to people who concentrate on the struggles in China, outside China, like me, that there's very little knowledge actually about the history, the concrete history of the actual existing socialism in China. Let's say from the 50s through to the 70s, and often the analysis starts with the reforms. The analysis of what China is or what's going on there now starts then. There are some exceptions. Like for instance, there's a very good book that I can recommend, written by Wu Cheng on it's called Cultural Revolution at the Margins, which basically argues, and I'm kind of like trying to do something similar. It argues we have to actually understand the socialist history of China in order to understand the capitalist history of China. Without that, we wouldn't even understand that. So we need some more like analysis of the past. Maybe you heard this case last year. It started of like a small workplace conflict at a factory in South China called Jasik, and then there was a mobilization of students supporting the workers and a lot of arrests. Actually, there's still dozens of people in prison till today. The people, the supporting students that went down there came with Mao pictures. I remember this because like people asked me in Europe, like, how come these people have like Mao? Like, they didn't know. And because the perspective that a lot of people outside China have on like Mao Zedong is like, this is a figure of the past, and Maoism is a thing of the past. In China, it's actually very important. A large part of the Chinese left is Maoist in some form or other. So I decided actually to do some more research, interviews, and write some texts on both the history of both socialism and capitalism in China, and also to focus on the Chinese left and see what kind of different positions we have historically and currently, to understand why it can happen that the Communist Party takes power in 1949, and then the Communist Party is still in power in 2019, and a lot of the story that how this happened, the trajectory in between is kind of blurred, and there are no really clear positions on that. If you have the feeling the story is very clear, maybe we can discuss that later. I think it's not very clear. Another aspect I want to mention before I start with more talking about the book is that in Europe and the US, obviously, there's a new interest in socialist politics. In New York, obviously, too, but you have that in Europe as well. And again, like often this even the term socialism, and you just also said you use the term communism. I think that it's often not really clear how this current perceptions of socialism are linked to the historical experiences. And for instance, I don't use these terms anymore at all because, definitely because of China, and you can't just use that word openly in China as a political term and expect people to understand what you mean. But also the same as in Eastern Europe, because I'm also being in Poland, involved in discussions there, and then, for instance, in Poland, that you cannot use that word, neither socialism nor communism, as kind of in a positive sense, because people just wouldn't get that, understand why you use that word. So when I read articles from the U.S. new sort of socialism and people in the Democratic Party and people really into this, then I wonder, so how does that connect to the experience of actually existing socialism? I was shocked when recently there was an interview, I think in The Guardian, with an advisor to Ocasio-Cortez, and the advisor said, well, not everything was bad in Eastern Germany, and he had some positive sort of things to say about Eastern Germany, which I thought was really strange. So again, this I think shows that we need actually a discussion on the socialist history in order to also understand what kind of plans we can have for the future and be prepared to not make the same mistakes as we have, in my view, have seen in actually existing socialism in Eastern Europe and in China. Okay, the book I'm presenting, or whatever the book idea, actually is it will not tell the whole story, obviously, from 49 till today. That would be a very long project. But I want to, and it won't be a comprehensive historical narrative, but more like a political critique of a certain debate or a certain view on China, on the socialism and capitalism in China, and it will include some kind of proposal on how to understand it in a way that's useful for future projects of overcoming capitalism and building a new form of society. Because that I think that's a precondition. We should learn first from the experiences before we make actually plans for the future. The way I do that differs a lot in one way from a lot of other books I know and descriptions that often start or put a lot of emphasis on what actors said, what they wrote, what the party programs was expressing, and sort of the communist narrative or socialist narrative of what socialism should have been. I look rather at the results, and of course that's a privilege of someone who writes about this many years later, right? So I can look at things and concentrate on the results. That doesn't mean I don't care about what Mao Zedong wrote about whatever, the 100 Flowers movement or something else, but I just don't think that's the most important aspect of when I want to understand what certain historical developments meant and what results they produce. I use a form of periodization, dividing the 70 years in 3 periods. Periodization is obviously just like a tool to visualize historical developments. The history doesn't work in periods; it works as a continuum, obviously. But it's a way to help us to understand. The usual periodization is pre-reform and post-reform, right? This or Mao era and reform era. This is classical. You find that in left-wing descriptions as well as liberal or other descriptions, academic descriptions. And the main, the sort of the dividing year is 78, when the Communist Party officially announced the policies of reform and opening. But I don't do that. I think it's misleading to do that. What I do is I look at socialism as a time between well, one date is 49, the declaration, of course, of the People's Republic, but I think it's mostly more accurate to actually name mid-50s, when basically the planned economy, collectivization, land reform was already accomplished, to say socialism started then. And I think the actual period of socialism ended in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, after the crackdown of the People's Liberation Army against the rebellious part of the Cultural Revolution, when the regime made the decision that they had to introduce changes. For instance, one thing was they started the new policies towards the USA. They became member of the UN, and they started actually some of the reform programs that were carried out after 78 were already formulated in the early 70s. So transition for me starts then, and I think the transition ended, or let's say, was accomplished in a certain sense in the mid-90s, when this Communist Party started the restructuring and partial privatization of the SOE, the state-owned enterprises, and also kind of transformed the planning mechanisms and institutions, and adapted them to some kind of like state-regulated form of market economy or state capitalism. So again, so the periods are mid-50s to early 70s to mid-90s, a transition period, and then after that I call it capitalism. I use these terms more descriptively because of course they are, maybe you know this, like there are arguments already in the 50s which called like, the socialist systems state capitalist, or said they're the same as, I'm not, my descriptions, the usage of these words is more like descriptive because I think they are distinctive, right? There is a difference between the planned economy in China in the 50s and 60s and what happened later in China, what I call capitalism today. The second thing is, of course, I have to simplify when I describe what happened in these three periods. I cannot look at every important aspect of like what a society is and what a system is. So I chose 5 main features that I will look at more in detail. One is, and I will go through these 2 of them later to explain you how I do it. And the main features I take are, one is value production and accumulation, so more or less economy. The second thing is social hierarchies, class hierarchies that I look at. The third one is gender relations, gender discrimination, and how that sort of changed over the years. The fourth one is state control, all the questions around like state power and the repression. And the fifth one is China's role in the global system of nation states, so kind of international aspects. So this is a simplification because, of course, we can, think about other aspects that would be important, like environment or, other social groups, not just the gender question. I'm not saying these are not important, but I just decided to focus on these 5. And then another thing I do, and again, it's simplification. I don't look at every single year of these periods in detail, but I choose the shorter periods of intensive struggles and countermeasures of the regime, like answers to these struggles. Because I think these periods are important to, like in certain phases, like a system or like political system is like gets unstable because of movements that from below that put pressure, that generate pressure, and then the regime answers, and that determines actually the direction, the next step of what a system does. And I will explain that later in detail. I look at six of these times, these periods, shorter periods of struggle. One is the 100 Flowers movement and the answer in the 50s. One is the Cultural Revolution. Then I look at what I call the democracy movements between 76 and 1980. There were several. One is the democracy wall movement. and then I look at Tiananmen Square movement, like the Tiananmen movement in '89, which is very important for the later development. And then in the capitalist times, I look at in the early stage, it was the state workers, the SOE, the state-owned enterprise workers, or the socialist working class, you could say, that started major struggles in the late '90s, early 2000s.
Hey Ralph, can you hold my close?
Okay, and the last one is the migrant workers struggle that it started basically to increase in numbers in the mid 2000s and probably peaked in the early 2010s. So these six periods of struggle I look more closely at. Okay, I can't give you a report on all the 5 features and all the struggles in detail here, obviously, because I don't want to speak a whole evening. But so what I would do is I would go through 2 of these main features and just talk about some of the main ideas I develop to give you an idea, and then we can later discuss that. If you have questions to the other aspects, of course we can pick that up later. So I would talk on just about this economical part, value production, accumulation, and then on the social hierarchies. And I go through these 3 periods and look at the trajectory and what changed. And look at 2, that's like kind of the last aspect of my method. I want to, in order to understand better, like, the relation between the socialist time and then how that was transformed and ended up in the capitalist system, I want to look at 2 sort of temporalities. Like, one is ruptures, like when something really changed rapidly at a certain time, like fundamentally. Like an example would be that definitely in the early 50s, with the land reform, there was actually like a very like a rupture in terms of the social relations in the countryside, where like the former landlords and richer peasants were actually like lost their land, and were actually like a few years later they were the bottom of the society. So there was actually a rupture in that sense, that it really turned upside down the whole social relations. That would be an example. And the other thing I look at, apart from ruptures, is continuities, like what has not changed at all or only gradually in a certain like slower way. And I come to that later, because of course that's one of my arguments, that the title of the book kind of suggests that that I see that actually socialism or communism in China paved the road to capitalism in a of course it's something we can say 50 years later or whatever, like many years later. So that would be like sort of a continuous development, but and there were certain aspects already in socialism that enabled or that made this transition possible, I would say. Okay, let's start with this aspect of the economy and value production. The Chinese economy was dramatically changed or transformed throughout the late 40s, already in the liberated areas, like that the Communist Party liberated in the Civil War, and then later in the whole of China after '49, when the Communist Party followed the model of the Soviet Union, because Soviet Union did support the Communist Party from the very start in the early 20s, and did so until the end of the 50s. There was a rupture, right, when Russia and China had a big split. But throughout the 50s, basically, the Soviet Union helped with financial means and with engineers and whatever, and also basically gave the Communist Party of China like the plan how to transform the economy and establish a planned economy. One of the main features of this was the land reform, obviously, that I already mentioned. But the other one was like a program of industrialization that focused largely on like capital goods industries, or like heavy industries, producing steel, producing machinery, this kind of stuff, and not on consumer good industries. Another feature was that they actually extracted a lot of the surplus that was produced on the countryside. China was still predominantly like a rural country. Agriculture was the largest sector by far, and they extracted surplus there and transferred that, used that for this industrialization program. That was official policy, right? It's not my interpretation. That was the official policy. It was kind of like, you could say in Marxist terms, like a form of primitive accumulation. And later, like this kind of model was also used in like former colonies, and was called catch-up development, like sort of repeating or substituting some kind of capitalist development through the means of, like a planned economy. That's kind of the logic. So you see, like it's built on like sort of a similar logic of using labor to produce value or to produce surplus, and then use that surplus and invest it in a certain development. So, which is kind of similar to capitalist thinking, with one exception, of course. The actor that's behind this, the actor that makes the decision, is not private capital. It's a state, and led by a party. But I must say, actually, and there are some good articles about this, if you want to read that this is not a black and white distinction, because a lot of the capitalist developments in places like Germany or South Korea, to give an example, were also led by the state, right? Not by a socialist state, by a capitalist state. So it's not that only in what are socialist countries the state takes this role of, deciding where, the surplus goes and how it's invested and what's done with it. Obviously there was a big difference still between the Chinese or Soviet model and the Western capitalist systems, because they used a state planning like institutions. I mean, the most obvious example is like the allocation of labor. So there was no labor market, but workers were allocated. You finished school and then you got a job somewhere where they put you. Of course, later that was done often by, like, if you were from a certain family, then you would go, all the kids would also go to the railways if the father was at the railway. So it's not that it was by chance that the state decided, whatever, by lottery or something. And I mean, there was a lot of like sort of, like you could call it even corruption or whatever, like certain ways of doing this with privileges and stuff. But it was different, done in a different way than in Western capital. That's just one example. I mean, of course, the prices were controlled, all other resources were controlled. So there's a big difference there. But in other ways, the Soviet model used a lot of mechanisms, economic mechanisms that are very similar, I think, to the capitalist system. First of all, one of the main goals was growth, and so it was kind of one of the, another form of productivism, which plays a role actually today, again, when we talk about the limits of capital accumulation, like how capitalism is destroying the environment, like our planet, whatever. That socialism basically did the same, in the sense of like putting growth first, and this sort of industrial development that also capitalism favored. I already mentioned the production of surplus. In the Marxist terms, of course, we would have a problem, because when we talk about value, then value should actually be realized in the market, and then there should be profits, and then they should be reinvested. So I'm not using this kind of standard Marxist terms to explain that, but definitely in socialism they used surplus. Workers worked longer than they would need to reproduce themselves, and that what they produced in that extra time, that was accumulated and reinvested. So in that sense, we have a similar mechanism. In terms of management, hierarchy, technology, it's already the Soviet development was based on certain technologies that I would call capitalist anyway, like Fordist forms of production, Taylorist forms of division of labor, like de-skilling of certain labor. There was a kind of a management system that The Soviet model was actually a one-man regiment. That's a term for that. Like, so you have one boss basically who's leading certain economic entities. So it was very hierarchical, and in that sense, copying like let's say a form of like reproducing social divisions between managers and workers, for instance. I come back to that later. And of course the in terms of separating the whole society in different classes, when you use these technologies like factories, and you create like a working class, and at the same time like a managerial like sort of layer, then you're producing a certain division, social division in society, which socialism did. So when the transition started in the early 70s, because of these similarities in terms of work hierarchies, technologies, value production, it was not such a big deal actually to start a project. 20 minutes? Yeah, okay. And so what happened was a gradual change of the older socialist forms of production, a gradual change into new forms. When for instance, they gave back the land to the households without privatizing it, but just giving families plots of land to develop. They gave the work units, like the managers, even more power and also more power over profits. They introduced like markets for certain goods. They liberated prices, but only in a limited way. And one big thing was there was a kind of de facto dispossession of the collective enterprises, especially on the countryside, but also in the cities. That by the sort of rural caterers, and they kind of like appropriated that over time and became like basically capitalist. In a development, like not from one day to the other, but over the long run. What I think is that this period, there are some arguments, of course, especially by certain Maoist groups, that this transition from this socialist, whatever economy to a capitalist economy was a plan, by the capitalist roaders. That's a term that's used. But I don't think that. I think this transition that happened at that time was actually more like an attempt to stabilize the system and kind of prevent like an exhaustion of socialism through reform, but not with the aim to get rid of socialism, but to strengthen it. But then what actually happened, and that's why we call it transition, was that these measures to transform the economy took on its own dynamic. The caterers who became like capitalists or who became like managers started making profit. Also, of course, there was the start of getting foreign capital involved. There was partial privatization, like official privatization, then in the 90s. So the dynamic of these processes produced capitalism basically, and at a certain point the CCP decided that's what they will go for in the end, and the realization of capitalism and capitalist relations in the 90s was the end process of this development. I see ruptures here, right? In two senses. One in the mid-50s with the collectivization of industries and the introduction of the planned economy. I see a rupture in the late 70s, 80s with the distribution of the land and kind of the reforms, and also again in the mid-90s. But I still think there's a continuity that capitalism could build, or let's say the development that happened in the transition period could build on certain aspects of socialism, certain infrastructure, skilled labor force that enabled the regime to basically realize capitalism in the 1990s. The second aspect is social hierarchies, and I think this is of course like one of the main features when you look at the social struggles also in the period of this time, that from the very start there was a, of course, like a party hierarchy that was also built through the Civil War, and like the fact that basically the Communist Party was a peasant army and not really a party in the very sense. And also there was a social hierarchy realized in the 50s already through this introduction of the Soviet model of what I just explained of industrialization, one-man regiment. But there was also like a very strict kind of more like caste system even established in the 50s, where and this is like something that annoys me often in discussions, because when people refer positively to Maoism, they say it was very egalitarian, and there was an iron rice bowl, like a set of like welfare for all the workers, and social workers were in control of the country. And then when you look at the urban working class that benefited from this iron rice bowl was very small in terms of like part of the population, and a large part of the population did not get all these benefits at all. But there was a really kind of like a very elaborate actually hierarchy between different types of workers and different types of enterprises or collectives. There was a huge difference in terms of like consumption and reproduction between peasants and urban population. And there was something that I did some research on this. I'm not finished with that, and I haven't really found much stuff, but there was migrant labor on a very large scale throughout socialism, and there was very large sections had temporary work contracts. And that's often forgotten. Like, people think migration started in the 80s and accelerated in the 90s. And I did start some quantification, and I found that, as I said, I'm not finished with that because they're not really very good numbers. But just like connecting numbers I find here and there, I think the number of migrants in communist China was about half of the number of migrants that we have today. But today we have like something between like 200 and 300 million migrants, which is probably probably more than half of the working class. Like in China is migrant, but in that time it might be like maybe 1/3 or a quarter, but it was still a substantial part that was hired by state-owned companies in cities as rural laborers for under temporary contracts. They got the worst job. It's the same as when you describe the situation of migrants today in some capitalist countries. They got the worst jobs. They didn't get all the benefits. They had to leave when there was more work. So they were discriminated because they were not allowed to stay in the cities. And this is not. I'm not talking about the 80s and 90s. I've talked about like the 50s and 60s. This is often forgotten, that you have this like large part of the working class or of the proletariat in China that was excluded from many of the benefits of what the social welfare state had to offer. I cut it short here. Of course, there was also a hierarchy among the cadres. So you have like very big class divisions within the Chinese society under socialism, and that of course was transformed. This system of class divisions was transformed in tradition, and again throughout capitalism. I cut this short now, but I think it's important that when we talk about socialism, that we understand that this was a class society. I come back to that in a minute when I talk about the struggles. Okay, so this is just two features I shortly spoke about, and I hope we'll have a discussion on that. Let me shortly come to some of these struggles I will look at in the book. I will not look at the 100 Flower movement and the democracy movement. I just pick out two of these movements to make it clear. All these movements generated they were like movements from below, including strikes and other popular mobilizations that usually started with like against certain like material conditions, like low wages, bad working conditions, exclusion, like rusticated youth who wants to come back to the city, like so whole ways of citizenship and stuff was at stake. But all these movements also produced like critique of the regime. And when we look at, like, for instance, the Cultural Revolution, which is one I want to look at now, that what's often forgotten, and with all this story, of course, it was started by Mao and some part in the party as a sort of mobilization of the Red Guards and stuff. I'm not talking about that part now, because that is true, but the main thing for me in the Cultural Revolution is that as soon as there was some space for organizing, as soon as there was some space for protest, a lot of groups, many of these excluded groups I just talked about, migrants, rusticated youth, veterans, took the chance to organize massive movements, with sometimes hundreds of thousands of members, and staged strikes, staged all kinds of uprisings. Sorry. Oh, it's raining?
It's raining.
Okay. Is that dangerous or?
It might be a little bit. Apologies also for the sounds upstairs.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's continue and I have another 10 minutes. So, Cultural Revolution was, in my view, was a radical movement. It doesn't mean that all the demands or all the theories that were discussed at the time I would support, but I think it's important to understand that it was not just like a power coup or some crazy movement of the Red Guards or something that it's often presented. And also the Communist Party officially thinks it was just years of craziness and trauma for the regime, but I think there were a lot of actual important social mobilizations, and the reaction of the regime was harsh because they feared that the Cultural Revolution would produce the end of their rule, and that's why they brought in the army and killed the uprising and actually they killed a lot of people as well in the process from these movements. And that triggered actually, I think this trauma and this movement that brought socialism basically to a point where it was not clear whether the regime would survive, produced actually the reforms, right? Produced experienced crisis management measures that where the regime actually tried to find a way to stabilize the system, to save or strengthen socialism in that sense. The other movement I will look at more closely in the book is of course Tiananmen, the movement in '89. Again, there's often a misunderstanding that I don't know about the States, but in Europe, where people think that was just a student movement and they just wanted democracy or something like this. But in fact, the essence of that movement was it was a popular uprising against the effects of the reforms. That the material conditions for the urban, the Tiananmen movement was an urban movement. It was not a movement in the countryside. So the urban conditions got really bad, got worse. Let's say through inflation, through corruption, through the introduction of labor contracts, the undermining of certain welfare, etc. And the outbreak that you see, there are hundreds of thousands of people involved, not just in Beijing, in many cities at the time against the regime, was not because they wanted to support the students and democracy, but because they were angry about the conditions and wanted political change. Of course, again, the government brought in the People's Liberation Army because, again, they feared that they would lose the Communist Party would lose its position. And that's what, after a period of consolidation, they started the last attack, let's say, or the last step to accomplish a new system, a new base for the rule of the Communist Party, which was the attacks on the socialist structures, the socialist enterprises, and the privatization and smashing of the iron rice bowl in the mid-90s. So again, in both cases, Cultural Revolution and the Tiananmen movement, you have this aspect of the regime like being attacked from movement from below was concerned with the material conditions, and then hitting back, and in both cases, even with military measures to save its rule, and then going another step in terms of promoting reforms in the case of Cultural Revolution, and in terms of like making the final step towards capitalism in the case of Tiananmen and the development in the 90s. So these are two movements. I will look in the book. I will look at obviously the other movements as well to understand better how in these periods, in these short periods of struggle, the movements from below put pressure on the regime, and then the regime reacted and took another step in the development. Just to wrap this up, I come back to the title of the book, A Communist Road to Capitalism. I think when we look at the whole thing and what I said so far, we could still say maybe the project just failed. The socialist project just failed because the people might have started it, might have had good intentions, and then it just didn't work out. But I think it was the wrong project from the very start. And in the book I try to, of course, explain that by saying there was this continuity in the sense of like certain economic structures that were established in the 50s already were not what people expected from a communist vision of a society, but were something else. And the same could be said about gender relations. The same could be said about these other features. So from the very start, they went into a different, in the wrong direction. Even though, of course, the people behind the movements often had hopes or expectations that, or believed the promises of socialism at the time. I think for today that's an important fact, because what does it mean for future projects if this model of socialism that was used at that time already was the wrong project? Maybe we should reconsider even the very basis of our own expectations for a project to overcome capitalism in the United States and elsewhere. Okay, I'll finish here and let's discuss it.
Thanks, Ralf, very much. So I'd like to invite up Kevin Lin and Loren Goldner to come do Singing in the Rain with us. All right, we're doing okay? Everybody more or less situated? Oh, we're gonna be okay. And there's room on the couch if people want to come up and have a soft seat. So let's pick up where we left off. I'd like to welcome Loren and Kevin up. Introduced them earlier. Maybe a good way to frame a discussion right now, right, is like what's the significance of different ways of understanding this history? Mm-hmm. Depending on who you are, you have a different reading of the history, and that has some sort of stakes for the present, right? Ralf, you've laid out a certain interpretation of when things happen, and implicit within that is some idea about the why they happened and how. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to hear a little bit from both of you. Maybe we could start with Loren about both the what do you make of Ralph's argument here with the periodization? What's its significance? And also, what are the stakes of different interpretations of that history? Why does it matter to us today? Is that a fair question to start with? Okay, cool. We'll have to kind of project. Okay.
No microphone?
No.
Okay. Well, I agreed with. I should start out by saying that Ralf, of course, knows a lot more about China than I do. I agreed broadly with most of what he said, but I'd like to introduce some of my own preoccupations. I just as a little background, I worked in South Korea for 4 years, 2005, 2009, teaching English but that to me was just a meal ticket while I got to know the Korean left and the Korean working class. And because the Korean working class had staged very militant strikes that had led to the apparent democratization of the regime, so it was possible to meet 1 million people. And I feel at a loss. I've been trying to do the same thing with China since about in the last 4 or 5 years, but I feel at a loss because I have no real hands-on relationship to what's going on in China. I don't know concretely a lot of people the way I did in Korea. So in some sense, I'm always worried about falling into a certain kind of abstraction. But let me just say, what's the time? I know. I mean, how much time do you want me to talk?
Let's say about gives you 5 minutes each on this answer, and then we can kick it around for a little bit.
Okay. Well, now I've already used up.
2 minutes and 30 seconds.
I wouldn't call China today exactly capitalist. I call it a transition to capitalism. It's a transition that began with the 1949 revolution and has intensified since then. But I don't really think, and this probably would get into sort of technical considerations, that until China is really fully integrated into the world market, that one can call it capitalism without any qualifications. And what I think the crucial dynamic in China today is the struggle of the working class, the rest of the population, to deal with the structures, for example, the official all China trade union federation, and so on, that clearly are an obstacle to a full emancipation of the working class. And this goes in tandem with the attempts of the regime to make this what I consider to be a full transition to the world market without losing control of the working class and the rest of the population. That to me is the issue that lies behind almost everything we can say about class struggle in China. But if I go any farther, I'm going to start getting into technical things that are going to run way past the amount of time that I'm allotted. But in particular, I think that, and again, this is a sort of a technical question, but the Chinese currency, the yuan, remains inconvertible. And unless that can change, I don't really think it's fully possible to talk about capitalism point blank. I look at, as the Chinese Communist Party does, I look at what happened in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe as a kind of a dress rehearsal for that transition, where that transition was completed around 1989. And of course, the Communist Party has studied what happened in Russia and Eastern Europe very carefully and has been trying mightily to avoid slipping into the same kind of dynamic. So in some sense, I would see just very broadly the current situation as a kind of a struggle between the ruling elite in China to make itself into a full-blown capitalist class, and the working class and other parts of the population who are also struggling in their own way to deal with the situation that has been dealt to them. But without going into any more detail would run past the time that I've been allotted. So I'll just leave it at that, and anybody, we can get into this in the discussion afterwards.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Ralf, for the wonderful talk. Just very briefly, I think I've been involved in mostly labor issues in China for about 10 years now. I think the first time I ever met Ralf was 2011, I think, in Sydney, Australia, and where he was also giving talks like this in bookstores in Australia, in leftist bookstores. I just have tons of questions or comments, so I'm just going to throw them around and see what happens. But I will start with periodization. I think I agree with that three phase: the Maoist period, the socialist period, the transitional period, and the capitalist period. And you can then subdivide those three periods into, which I think Ralf did as well. In each period, there are also phases or periods within those periods that I think is also really, and maybe you want to sort of elaborate on those as well. So it's not as if each period is a uniform, time. There are also changes and ruptures and a lot of continuities are obviously within those periods. So maybe you want to elaborate a little bit more on those periods within periods. That's the first question. The second question I think is, you presented and the sort of title of your book, The Communist Road to Capitalism. It just gets me thinking about to what extent those paths, those roads is predetermined, and to what extent at every in every crisis, right, the Cultural Revolution or 1989, at all those points, to what extent are those pretty much determined? Or if we're looking at class forces, balance of class forces, is there a possibility that was not the path? There is a different path, for whatever reason that did not go forward. So maybe Ralf, you want to talk about maybe just pick one example, 1989. Was there a possibility that the popular uprising, as you said, was not just students, it was a lot of workers? If you look at pictures of the time in Beijing, it was state sector workers, state-owned factory workers, supporting students. It was 500,000, I think maybe up to 1 million people in some of the largest demonstrations in Beijing. So obviously not all of them are students, right? It's only a tiny, small percentage of them. So maybe there's that question of balance of class forces that determined or at least shape the result of this crisis and the ways get resolved or don't. Another question, I think again stay on the sort of class relations. How do you see let's say the socialist period? How do you see the state bureaucracy? How do you conceptualize? Is that a class, or is it just it's a bureaucracy, or is it something else? How do you see them in relation to workers? Are they essentially assume the role of the capitalists in terms of value production and extraction and allocation? So how do you conceptualize the state and the bureaucracy as a class or something different? Another question, it's a comment, but I also want to hear you sort of elaboration. Is in the socialist period there was basically we hear about the 100 Flowers campaign, which is anti-rightists, essentially anti-liberals, anti-intellectuals, campaign. But there's also obviously also an announced campaign against the left. So all the left dissidents, Trotskyists, anarchists, there's basically very few anarchists around, but Trotskyists mainly, that were basically either jailed in the 50s, in the 40s, going back to the 40s and 30s, right? But in the 50s also, a lot of them were jailed. If they stayed in mainland China, many fled to Hong Kong, to Europe, I think some to Australia even. So how can you talk a bit more about the way in which the Chinese state in the socialist period not only campaigned against or eliminate the rightists, whatever you think that whether they're rightists or not, but also the leftists, the left oppositionists, and because you do mention there were critiques by workers, etc., and they seem because of their political position, even though they may not really be what we think are Trotskyists right now, in the U.S. in U.S. or European context. Nevertheless, there are the left oppositions. So can you talk about them a little bit more and how the state essentially eliminated those left oppositions, so that when China began to reform and transition, there is basically absence of left oppositional voices in those periods, and how that shaped the discourses and the sort of ideological environment at those points. And make one more comment before I just finish. Just give me one moment.
Yeah.
So just one final comment. Just pick back on what you said about Fordism, mentalism that already exists in Mao's period. So as Ralf said, the state sector in China in the Maoist period, in the socialist period, was very much modeled on the Soviet model. There's changes; it's not exactly the same. I think it's slightly softer the Soviet model, but nevertheless, the underlying relations of production or in productions are broadly similar to what you would see in a capitalist economy or capitalist factory. So that when China began to transition in the 70s and 80s, those relations I don't think they change much because they are essentially capitalists already within the factories. Sure, that workers lost a lot of job security and a lot of benefits, and many got laid off. But nevertheless, the relationships within the factories did not really change. So how do you conceptualize that? Is that one of your continuities? And if so, what does it say? I think it speaks to your central argument about continuity, about the communist path to capitalism. That at the very heart of the economy, the how you organize production, is already capitalist in essence from the very beginning. That's all.
Ooh, those are very rich questions. Let me sum up those 5, right? So we have them. Is that useful?
Yes.
So the one is an invitation to talk about sub-periods within the periods that were laid out, and questions of periodization. 2 is, if socialism as we knew it was a communist road to capitalism, is that road predetermined? Is it a sure thing? Or could there have been other detours? 3, how do you understand bureaucracy? A crucial thing, if we have an understanding of what socialism was, we have to have some analysis of what is this bureaucracy that arises. Is it a class, is it not? 4, an invitation to speak a little bit about the repression of the left in the socialist period and its implications over time. And 5, Taylorism, relations of production, what's the nature of those continuities? Okay, so that's 30 seconds each. Go.
Okay. Well, all important, but you forgot Loren's question here. But okay, let's first answer to Kevin's. Sub-periods, yeah, of course. I started actually mapping out, like making a big table with the sub-periods as well, because also not just the times of like grassroots movement and then the reaction of the regime. There were also periods of like consolidation where basically the regime didn't carry on with a reform or something, but just had to deal with like internal divisions in the party, for instance. So there's a way of subdividing this, and I take your advice to lay that out more in detail. Communist road predetermined, of course not. I would say, I think history, when we look back at history, we have the tendency to see a logic or a sense in history. But then, of course, history often doesn't make sense. And there's so many, such a complex process, and also like so many contingent moments, like decisions of certain people at a certain position at a certain time. That's just an example. There's a lot of different factors. So I would say in all the periods or sub-periods, there were moments where you could say like a certain decision, a certain move of certain people or the party produced a certain direction, or a certain movement failed. And if it would have won, the whole thing would have gone in a different way. So to take your example with Tiananmen, the one important aspect of Tiananmen movement is that within the regime, inside the top of the Communist Party, people sympathized with some of the demands of the students, because they thought that they need to stabilize their rule, they need reforms. So basically, they believed in glasnost or perestroika, the Soviet, word for this opening, whatever. Of course, again, in retrospect, we can say maybe the Soviet Union, the glasnost was the wrong decision from the perspective of the regime, because they basically lost, especially, let's say the top, maybe the medium level actually won, but the top cadres in the Soviet Union lost their power, and the system, whatever, collapsed. So maybe the Communist Party made the right decision to save the rule. But again, that's also just speculation. So I completely go with you here that we should, I think we of course we look for logic, but then it doesn't mean that things had to happen this way. And I'm really against this like determinism and this idea of like history. That's also part of like Marxism or Marxism-Leninism, and the weakness that they think that history has a direction, and it has to go into this direction. I think this narratives don't really work. Bureaucracy, there's a lot of literature on this. It's actually one of the factors that you find a lot of stuff on, like the dynamics of like how this bureaucracy developed. The number of cadres exploded. So basically there was a certain like class of cadres that had certain positions within the Communist Party and then the state administration in the early 50s, and then this number just exploded. They got more and more, and they formed a class in the sense. And now I'm not talking about like how the bureaucracy worked, but like how this ruling class reproduced itself. So in a very early, that's just one part of the answer. But in the very early stage already, they formed their own structures like schools, medical services, and all this kind of literature, just for the rulers. And they even lived in certain compounds, and of course the Beijing class did that, but it also happened in other parts. And so they started to also sort of reproduce it themselves. So the princeling is a word for, that the sons, and some daughters, mostly sons, very patriarchal. I didn't talk about that today, but of course, and when we follow the gender story, we have another long continuity. But the princeling is the description of the sons of former cadres, in history, who now are top leaders. But this is not new. This already happened in the socialist period, So in the way, even biologically, the class reproduced itself. But this, I agree with you. We have to look at this more closely. Anti-leftist purges. I think this is one of the. This is my perspective. I have to tell you a little bit. I'm from West Germany, but I had contacts in the 80s, throughout the whole 80s to East Germany, and we would go over and our left-wing anarchist, whatever, radical friends in East Germany, they were all purged somewhere in prison. So there was a really tough sort of repression, a lot worse than what happens in China today, against left-wing movements. So of course in all this state socialist, whatever, socialist countries, we had this repression of left-wing movements, including in East Germany, it was usually prison sentences, long-term prison sentences for them, and that happened in China. And as you said, it started in the 30s, even you could say go back to the 20s if you want, and the whole idea, these purges, these campaigns, were often to purify the party structures from dissident movements, and that partly that was based on different ideas of whatever the communist line, but partly was just also power struggles, getting rid of certain people. So that's definitely a main aspect, and you're completely right, that also meant that at certain points in the whole period, there was no left-wing opposition that could resist in any way, in an organized way. We have that situation now, right? Or I think that there's some element of that in the current repression, to get rid of certain circles and people there. But I must say one thing here, because I think it's wrong to think that the Chinese regime is just using repression. In socialism, in every of these movements, they managed to also co-opt part of the critique and part of the actors, the people who express the critique, into their system. And that makes also the strength. Makes out the strengths of the regime, both the socialist regime for a long time, and then what I call the transitional regime and the capitalist regime, that they are able, despite very authoritarian structures, they are able to co-opt movements and to use movements and to use Deng Xiaoping used the democracy wall movement, for instance. They used the Tiananmen movement. So I think that has to also be considered. And the last thing about the Soviet model and the differences, I think it's wrong. In my view, I don't want to use the same terms for different things. So that's why I'm careful and would say yes, there were certain mechanisms they produced value in a certain way and stuff like this, but I would not call that capitalist, because I think then there's the danger to give the impression it was the same, but it wasn't. There were major differences in the this is not like based on like some like sort of more ideological or theoretical aspects. It's more based on like to see like that in certain historical periods a system as a whole had a difference to another system. It doesn't mean that certain structures weren't the same. So I'm more careful in that sense. And this goes also back to your thing in a certain sense, because I think you can point out, and I agree with you, that certain aspects of the current model of China, and you mentioned the currency, there are also some other parts, make China different from other capitalist systems. But I follow, actually here I follow, I don't know, this guy writes in German. It's a guy called Tobias ten Brink. He wrote a book in German called Chinese Capitalism, China's Capitalismus. Unfortunately, it's impossible to translate that because it was a habilitation dissertation, and it's so complicated to even read in German. But he uses something I learned from him somehow. He also uses like sort of a descriptive model of understanding the Chinese trajectory, and he always uses capitalism, socialism in the plural. He always talks about capitalisms and socialisms, because he says that it's no capitalism is the same. And when you look at like the U.S. system today and the let's say the Polish or the German system, you can find a lot of differences. We will still agree. I mean, hopefully that U.S. is capitalist and Germany is capitalist, but still there are many major differences. So the Chinese. In the Chinese case, there are definitely major differences to other capitalisms, but I would still say that, and here I'm mostly basing my analysis on the social relations of production, right? So what are workers facing in terms of exploitation? How do they have to deal? And also what's the interest of the ruling class in terms of making profit or whatever, strengthening their rule. And there I see that that's why I say it's already capitalism, not still in transition. Okay, it was longer, sorry.
I want to open us up for some discussion and feedback, right? But I want to see if I can also throw two questions at you guys that we can tag team or see what we can do. One is, you've mentioned when you eventually write this up into a full manuscript, you're going to focus on 5 different features running throughout these 3 time periods. And in each of the time periods, the 5 features are affected by moments of rupture and continuity and struggle. Right? One of those was gender and patriarchal relations. I wonder if you could speak a little bit on what are the continuities and ruptures there running through those 3 time periods. And the second question may be related. What has the role of Chinese nationalism been in each of these different periods into the present? How does that affect the current balance of forces in politics today? Is that fair? I'll throw those two at them. And then,
I can answer this, but please, if any one of you wants to speak, I spoke a lot, so if you have any feedback, please just tell me. Otherwise, I will speak about these 2 important issues. Some years ago, I wrote a text called Mao's Patriarchy, which was basically like I looked at different reviews of books women had written about the development of gender relations in China, and for me it was important to understand more in detail how this like kind of concept. I mean, the liberation, the promise of the liberation in the 30s was the liberation of women, right? That was included in the whole Communist Party propaganda and arguments, and women played a role also in these discussions, obviously. And there was a rupture. There was definitely a rupture in 49, 50. because the women were like, the legal framework was changed, so the women actually had sort of a legal equality, so, and that has to be stated. They made a law for the divorce law. Women were allowed to work outside the house. So that was definitely a rupture. And if you look at countries that didn't have that kind of like socialist rupture, like India today, but had a very similar kind of setup, you see the continuity of a certain like form of, for instance, like restricting women to the household, which still exists in large parts of India, and something that has been disrupted in China in the early 50s. So there was a rupture. But then, and when you read, like I collected a lot of stuff on the early part, the 50s and 60s. There was actually also feminist literature also in Western countries on this development, and there was a struggle because some women from the feminist movement would say, well, China is on the way, to liberate women because women are now part of the labor force, and and they were. I mean, that was the big step. But then they basically were restricted to that. So the liberation of women was basically the liberation of women as wage laborers, and a lot of the other like kind of cultural parts or like social relations in villages, whatever, were not broken up. So the revolution for the women you could say it only happened halfway, or it only happened in the aspect that was important for the socialist state, which was to use women as labor, and that was realized, but the rest of the liberation didn't happen. And obviously one very clear example is that women still were the ones who did the unpaid reproductive labor and are until today the people who do that, and that was not even discussed as like sort of like something that should have happened or something. There was a very short period in the Great Leap Forward where actually housework or reproductive labor was socialized or was taken away from the women, but only very shortly, but not in general. There was another rupture, you could say, with the reforms in the 80s, but which is more connected to the possibility of women to migrate, and the migration I think has this double nature, because on one hand migration is obviously again like labor power that moves from one place to another and then used in the new factories, whatever, and then women found themselves in like a new generic division of labor, right? Like they were used for the whatever the consumer industry, factory work on the assembly lines, and I don't know whether you read Punai wrote a good book about this Made in China, where she looks at especially this situation of women at the assembly lines, and described very clearly that they were exploited as women workers at this point. On the other hand, migration opened a possibility for the women to escape the rural patriarchal setup in the families, and that's something I understood. I started doing interviews with women workers in the late 2000s, and that was one of the most prominent, sort of most important aspects of their experience of migration. It was, and they wouldn't express that in terms of like feminist terminology. They would say, I don't want to go back to the village because my parents just want me to marry. So that migration was a way to gain more control over their lives. So it has this double nature, and I think this is something that is a rupture, because their mothers who lived on the countryside in the village didn't have that chance to kind of gain more control over their lives. So this is just two aspects. I think it's a long other discussion that I will in the book I will also of course address like the feminist debates and the different aspects of women's struggles that happened in socialist China and later as well. But definitely there is a continuity of like let's say like the existence of patriarchal relations, but you have certain elements of ruptures where women were successfully gaining more control over their lives for a certain time or period or for certain groups. And nationalism, that's actually an important question, not just for the socialist case and for the Chinese case, but in general. But let's focus on China here. Of course, the part of the the legitimacy of the Communist Party from the 50s on was that it won it was part of the forces that won the anti-imperialist war against the Japanese occupiers, and that is sort of also like they established a modern nation state, right? That what the Kuomintang, the previous nationalist government, didn't accomplish, they accomplished. So they made China, like they put China on the map, let's say, as a nation state and as a strong state too, and as of course as a global power. But this is part of actually the legitimacy until today, like that the Communist Party, had a, like put China on the map and like sort of is fighting for Chinese national interests. And of course, when in the 50s it was mixed with, it was like the typical national liberation arguments you would have with many colonies as well in the 60s and 70s, like sort of liberation in terms of social liberation and national liberation. But it was, of course, the socialist aspect was really important. But then in the late 70s, early 80s, basically the Communist Party, first they abolished the class system, but then they abolished the class discourse. So the class struggle doesn't play a role anymore in the official discourses of the Communist Party. Until today, they talk about Marx. They say, like Xi Jinping is a Marxist and has references to him and stuff. So they use the Marxism, right? I'm not saying they use they don't use these like sort of general theories, but it's basically without class struggle, the aspect of class struggle. And officially the Communist Party opened up in 2001, still under Jiang Zemin, they opened up to like capitalists as members of the Communist Party, and it has transformed itself basically to the party of capitalists in China. I mean, capitalists in a very broad sense, including like state actors, obviously. And nationalism is supposed to be, the last sort of glue that keeps together, like sort of or that gives some ideological base to the rule of the Communist Party. But I heard a talk a year ago that I thought was very interesting, because a Chinese journalist who studied the nationalist mobilizations, like there was one, the repeated one against Japan about some islands a few years ago. There was something against France around the Olympics some years ago. There was one around Korea because of some rocket anti-rocket systems. But what he said was that on one hand, yes, the Chinese regime is sort of using nationalism as this kind of glue and in this propaganda. On the other hand, the Chinese, this Communist Party also wants to prevent nationalist grassroots movements because it's afraid of any of this kind of like movement. So they stop. They don't want like to. They're more careful. They don't want like that people get too excited about. Because there were some demonstrations, for instance, all these cases I just gave Japan, France, and Korea, but they try to kind of keep that down. They don't want that to escalate because they're also afraid of that we got to get out of hand. And I think that aspect is important because in other cases, right, in other countries, and you have that here, obviously. But you have that in many European places too. The populist right-wing governments, they are playing with popular, movements, right-wing movements, and they're playing with fire, right? And you could say in that way. And I think China tries to more like sort of stay in control over
this. Briefly comments on either of those two questions, and then we'll have some space for comments here.
Well, I just wanted to amplify a little bit some of the things I didn't feel I had time to talk about. And one of them is, if we look at this periodization that Ralf introduced, it's pretty much straightforward in much of the writing about China, that at every juncture, the working class played a crucial role that often was sort of in the background of Western coverage of China, but absolutely not in the background of the concerns of the Communist Party elite. In 1958, in the 100 Flowers movement, there was a strike wave throughout industry that really, as far as I know, was almost not discussed in the Western press. During the Cultural Revolution, as Ralph said, all kinds of groups emerged, at least briefly, before they were repressed by the People's Liberation Army. And one in particular I find extremely interesting. It's called the Shen Wuliang. Shen Wuliang emerged in Shanghai in 1968, and they wrote a manifesto, which you can find online. It's just called "Whither China?" ? And it basically was read all over China, and the party elite flipped out when they read it, because they were very clear that what was going on was the dress rehearsal for an actual revolution against the control of the party. Finally, in 1989, as I once long ago learned from Ralph, that what was going on was not merely in Beijing and not merely at Tiananmen, it was all over the country. And but when the People's Liberation Army came to Tiananmen for the final crackdown, it was at 5 o'clock in the morning, all kinds of people were asleep in these tents, and the PLA units headed straight for the tents of the workers. And many of the students, who were, of course, children of the Chinese elite, were allowed to leave before the final crackdown. So, once again, one has to always understand in terms of these periodizations that the class balance of forces is really central. Now, as for nationalism, my study of China has taken me farther and farther back in Chinese history, and recently I've gotten into the Qin dynasty, which was in the period, had its kind of high point in 200 BC. And they were interesting because they actually, for the first time, unified the country. That the Western word China comes from the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty burned thousands of books, confiscated them, and killed something like 4,600 literati. And just to show, the Qin dynasty was one of Mao's favorite dynasties. And he said, "What is all this talk about the Qin dynasty? We've killed 460,000 people, and we've confiscated far more books." So there is a real continuity, which I'm trying to learn more about, in terms of the imperial state that grew out of these early dynasties and what happened after 1949 in particular. So in terms of nationalism, there is this really remarkable 3,000 or 4,000 year kind of backdrop to this sense. One thing that I think has to be pointed out is that unlike many other so-called developing countries, in the belief in China is not so much that we're moving towards something as it is that we are trying to recover something that we lost as a result of imperialist attack and domination starting in the 19th century. So
I'm going to have to pause and maybe cut it short, actually, because folks are saying that we're actually going to need to call a plumber for the leak through the ceiling. So maybe because of conditions in the space, we'll actually have to cut here. But we can continue some discussion together at. Sorry about that.
I basically said pretty much everything I wanted to say.
Okay. Sorry.
I don't have anything to add anyways.
Okay. Let's give a hand. Thank you, Aeon, for hosting us, and thank you guys for taking this way and this way. Appreciate it.